Guys, let's get started. It's a Friday. So again, we're going to get to wherever we get to, and then we'll decide what's going to be for Shabbos and where we'll pick it up on Sunday. And again, as always, if I have the time today, I will try to record Shabbos's daf. So if anybody wants to learn over Matzah Shabbos, they'll have it to learn over Matzah Shabbos. But first, let's do today's daf. We're holding on the bottom of 75b2, all the way on the bottom of Ayin Hey Amid Beis at the Mishnah. So we're continuing with regard to the roasting. We're continuing with regard to the roasting of the Karban Pesach and all its various laws that apply to being fire roasted. If you remember, it said Sli Eish, you have to burn it on fire. And we got into a whole discussion yesterday on what is fire, right? Is what and how expansive is the definition of fire? And as we pointed out 2 days ago, this has an effect on today's halachas as to what is electricity, what is LED lighting, etc. Is that fire? Is it not fire, etc. But anyways, we continue along that similar vein in the next Mishnah. The Mishnah says as follows. Again, the bottom of 75b2. Noga becharsai sheltana. If the carcass, meaning the behemoth, the Karban Pesach that you shechted, you're now roasting it. And you're roasting it in an earthenware oven, for lack of a better word. Noga becharsai sheltana. If the carcass, the skin, touches the surface of the earthenware hot earthenware surface, you should peel off its place. That means simply taking off the upper level of the carcass where it touched the oven. That's it, just a simple peel of the skin. However, if some of the gravy from the food, right, so some of the liquid of the animal comes out and drips onto the floor of the oven, of the earthenware oven, and then bounces back onto the animal, then the din is yitol es mekaimai. Now you have to remove its place. Not enough simply to remove the upper level of the animal. You have to actually take a knife and cut away a piece of the animal itself. And the reason again is this. It needs to be fire roasted. It cannot be roasted al yedei on something whose heat was derived from a fire. Since the floor of the oven is a surface that got hot, not from itself, but from the fire, so it's a derived heat. So therefore, in any one of these cases where it touched in one form or another the floor of the oven, depending on where we're standing, right, some piece has to be removed from the animal. So in other words, on the Karban Pesach, where the carcass touches the floor, you peel away that area. Where it's the gravy, which is much more, much more in depth, and the gravy goes in, here already you have to go ahead and cut away a piece of the flesh. Goes further in the Mishnah, notat mirutvai ala soilis. If some of this gravy should fall onto flour in which you went ahead and caked the floor of the oven, you have to remove a handful of this flour from its place, because the flour is sitting there by the very fact that the gravy lands on the flour. The flour then becomes is now capable of being fried. It's being fried. You now have fried flour from the gravy of the Karban Pesach. By definition, you're not allowed to use it. Since you're not allowed to use it, you have to take it to the side, and you take it to the side, and you burn it like any other disqualified offerings, because it was from the gravy of the Pesach fell out onto the flour, which because of the liquid went ahead and got fried. Now it's got to go ahead and be taken apart. Further, Sachu b'shemen truma. If somebody took and basted the carbon pesach with oil of truma, if the group that was counted on this carbon pesach who registered were all kahanim, no problem. They can eat from it because you smeared it with truma oil. They can eat from it. We're now on 75b3. In Shal Yisrael, but if the people who registered on the animal are only regular Jews, Levium and Yisrael, so now we got a problem that you basted this with oil of Cheruma, Im Chai, if the carcass is still raw. It's not yet been roasted. Go ahead and just simply rinse it off, because raw meat rinses off easily. But if it's already roasted, now you have to peel off the outside skin, because once it's roasted, so the juices burn out, there are now crevices that are created in the animal. Crevices are created in the animal. The oil went into the animal at least skin deep. You have to remove, you have to peel off the skin. Says the Mishnah Vayta, if one smears it with oil of Maisa Sheni, again, Maisa Sheni is that food which needs to be brought up to Yerushalayim, and then once it's brought up to Yerushalayim, then you could eat it in Yerushalayim. But the halacha is like this: if you have the food, let's say in Tiberia, you're allowed to go ahead and redeem it onto money, and that money you would bring from Tiberia to Yerushalayim, and then spend that money in Yerushalayim. So the actual Sheni has to be spent in Yerushalayim. So the halacha is that if you didn't redeem it in, let's say, Tiberia, and you simply brought your food to Yerushalayim, once the food's coming within the walls of Yerushalayim, that's it. They can no longer be redeemed. They themselves must be eaten. That's the rules. So here's the case. You're in Yerushalayim, and he based the carbon pesach with the oil of the Maisa Sheni. So the halacha is like this: he's not allowed to charge its values to the members of the group who are registered on it. They're eating from his oil. In other words, the meat was smeared with the oil of Maisa Sheni. It's his Maisa Sheni that they're benefiting from. Says the Gemara, says the Mishnah, She'ein moichrin, switch the word poidin. She'ein moichrin Maisa Sheni b'Yerushalayim. Because Maisa Sheni is not sold in Yerushalayim. Say it's Maisa Sheni if it's brought into Yerushalayim. From that moment on, it cannot be redeemed or sold onto money. Therefore, this guy cannot make money from the fact that other people are benefiting from his Maisa Sheni. Because that once Maisa Sheni gets within the walls of Yerushalayim, it itself must be eaten. You're not allowed to go ahead and put it onto something else. Okay? Says the Gemara, Itmar, Cham l'soy cham, if hot food fell into a hot beverage, or vice versa. In other words, hot fell into hot, and it's a case, obviously, where one of them, if one of these hot things is a forbidden object, meaning, let's say it's truma into chulin. Let's say it's truma into chulin. So whichever one of these is truma is going to go ahead and make the chulin usher to anybody but a kohen. Divrei Hakol, everybody agrees, and now we're on I usher, that it's definitely usher. As Rashi on top says, the bala heter me'isser, because the heter took in from the isser dika thing. Now this is very important because this is a ma'isa b'chol yom v'yom. You're in the kitchen and you cooked up milk, and then it splatters into hot meat. The halacha is, since it's hot, too hot, what is the answer? You got to throw it away, right? It's no good. But cold into something cold, divrei hakol mutter. So cold milk into cold meat, all you have to do is rinse off the meat and you're good to go. Okay, this is very important. This happens all the time in the kitchen. right? Hot into hot, milchig hot into fleshig hot, or vice versa. Verfutscht. Milchig cold into fleshig cold, or fleshig cold into milchig cold. Just rinse it off. You're good to go. What happens if I have a hybrid? Cham l'soich tzoynein. Something hot falls into something cold. But tzoynein l'soich cham, or the opposite way. Cold falls into something hot. Now we come to a machlokes. Rav Oma Eloi Govar, the upper one, the thing that fell in, whatever was the falling thing, the active component, that dominates. Shmuel Tato Govar dominates. The passive one dominates. So, in other words, if the fleischiks is in a pot and it's hot, okay, and a cold milk falls onto it, according to Rav, wouldn't be a problem. According to Shmuel, it would be a problem. Because Rav says the active one, the last one, the one falling in, is how we determine. Since the one falling in was cold milk, just rinse it off and we're good to go. Shmuel says the bottom one, the passive one, not what's falling in, but the thing that has the thing falling into it. In this case, that's the piece of hot meat, and it has cold milk that falls into it. The hot meat will asser the milk that fell onto it and asser itself. So says the Gemara like this. Tanan, we learned, and this Gemara again is applicable almost every day. It is certainly applicable in every restaurant. It's the reason why we don't allow combined kitchens, even if from one side is milchiks and one side is fleischiks. We do not allow, and if a guy has two restaurants that are really one, half is milchiks and half is fleischiks, he's got to put a wall in between, because otherwise you're dealing with these questions on a daily basis. So, Tanan, we learned, if the gravy falls onto earthenware from the carbon Pesach and splatters back onto the carbon Pesach, one should remove its place. Because logically, what are we talking about? With the cold earthenware, that the carbon Pesach is dealing with a cold earthenware oven. Now, that the upper one is the dominant. Now it makes perfect sense, since it's the gravy that was on top and it comes down and splatters, right? For the gravy initially goes and heats up the cold earthenware. The hot gravy falls onto the cold earthenware, heating up the earthenware. Right, since the gravy's the top, the gravy fell onto the earthenware, and then the heated earthenware in turn heats up the gravy. So now you got the problem. So if the gravy splatters back onto the Pesach, the Pesach is partially being roasted up from the heat of the earthenware. Because the upper, let's get the case again, the gravy falls onto the earthenware. So the gravy is the strength, according to Rab, because it's coming from on top, Eloi Govar. It falls onto the earthenware. It affects the earthenware because Rab says the thing that's falling is the determinant factor, is the dominant factor. So the thing that's falling is the one that makes the earthenware hot. Now the earthenware is hot, and the gravy, it therefore heats back up the gravy that fell on it, and the gravy that fell on it bounced back onto the Pesach. There's my problem. But, right, and what's going to happen? Because that gravy that burns back, it turns out that that piece of where it bounced back roasted up the Pesach, rubs up from something that was a derived heat, the earthenware floor, which is now a derived heat and not directly from the fire. And the Torah says fire roasted. And and not something that's roasted from something that is a derivative of fire, that was simply warm, heated from a fire source. The source has to be the direct fire itself. So the place where the gravy splattered, having been reheated from the floor of the earthenware, that place has to be, it's splattered back onto the Pesach. That place is the place where it needs to be cut from the animal. Elul Shmuel Dama Tato Gobar says the lower one dominates. That means the floor, the earthenware floor is going to be the dominant factor, not the gravy falling, but the cold floor. And therefore, we got this. Now we got a problem. Cheres, since the earthenware is cold, it cools off the gravy, because we say which one is the dominant one according to Shmuel, not the thing that's falling, which is hot, but the thing which it's falling into. In this case, was the floor of the earthenware, which is cold. So the cold has an adverse effect on the gravy, cooling off the gravy. So when the gravy bounces back onto the Pesach, it's cold gravy. It's cold gravy. Why do I have to cut away the place where it touches? It's not being roasted. It's not that gravy was not roasted from a derivative. From a derivative of a fire, from something that was warm from a fire. On the contrary, it was cold, and now the gravy bouncing back itself is only cold. It has no effect. So how is Shmuel going to explain this? After the Gemara, the Shmuel, the Mishnah is talking about with hot flour. The floor of the oven is smeared with flour, with hot flour. Hot earthenware. No, an oven that was already preheated. Since it was already preheated, even according to Shmuel, you still got the problem. Could not from the gravy, but the gravy which fell onto the floor of the oven. The floor of the oven is the dominant. It's hot, which because the fire underneath it heated it up. So it's not the fire source. It's only a derivative of the fire source. So the heat in that oven now reheats the gravy. The gravy bounces back and hits the carbon Pesach. The spot where it hits the carbon Pesach has to be cut away. Okay? So and we're going to keep on having case of this. Yes, Charlie.
So I just wanted to say that I saw that Rashi comments that the halacha usually follows Rav of Shmuel on Isurim, but not in this case. In this case,
correct.
We follow Shmuel.
No, we follow Shmuel. And I didn't want to say it yet. But so,
I'm sorry,
No. But since you brought it up, I wanted to get to the end of the machlokes because there's going to be three other cases.
Sorry.
No, but since Charlie brought it up, it's important to know. The halacha is Rabbi Isurim, by things that are Isser veheter, permitted or forbidden. The halacha is always like Rav. The halacha is like Shmuel, all over Shas, the Dinei Mominus, in the case of money. The reason for this is not because either one of them didn't know the halachas of the other. Shmuel was the Rav of Nardoi Pumpadisa, which was the New York of its time. It was a major metropolis. Shmuel was busy all the time with monetary situations. Rav deliberately was the Lakewood of its time. Back when Lakewood was a small little town when Rabbi Aaron Kotler started, or Boca Raton 15 years ago. Okay? Meaning it was he deliberately went to Surah, which was in the Val, which was in the woods, to the west. I believe it was to the west of Pumpadisa. And there, because he wanted to be David with Hashem, in other words, we say Shmuel was Rav Shamshon Rafal Hirsch, and Rab was a Chassidish Yid, was like the Baal Shem Tov. He was in the woods, that's why you do it. Shmuel was a man of the earth, man of the world. Shmuel was the scientist, the professor of Shas. What I am saying is, in fact, a rush. It's a rush in the Bava Kama, where he says it's not that, it's that each one had a chush, his personality drove him in a certain direction. Rav's personality was more into Zohar and Kabbalah and all that, into the day-to-day living of the world, which is the reason why he became the expert in science and expert in mind. This case is one of the rare cases where we paskin like Shmuel by an Isser Veheter, and we paskin that Tog Govak. And the truth of the matter is we should understand why. We said it yesterday. Keboloi kach poltoi. Just in the way that it takes in when it's cooked is the way it gives out. Right? It gives out, it spits out the thing. Or in other words, what we say about human mind. Be careful what you put in there. What you put in. What? I'm so sorry. The single one. I'm getting a call from Boca. Hello. Yes. I'm sorry. You received my what? Oh yes. Could you call me back after 9 o'clock? Just because I'm just in the middle of something right now. Is it possible to call me back at 9 o'clock? Yeah, no problem. So call me back right after 9. Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye. Sorry about that. My pool motor broke down. I'm getting it replaced from Brooklyn. Anyway, so
that's
here
why
we go.
That's why we say,
yeah.
Torah loy b'shamayim hi tatoe govar.
Say it again.
We say that Torah loy b'shamayim hi.
Very good. Very good.
Tatoe govar. We are the decider. The bottom one wins.
Right. In other words, my father says there's a machlokes. Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai says Shamayim nivra tchila v'achar kach. First the heavens were created, and then this earth. Beis Hillel says just the opposite. The earth was created first, and then the Shamayim. So we paskin like Hillel that Torah loy b'shamayim. Torah is not in heaven. It's ours to work. Or another way, to take my step further, Hakol midei Shamayim. Everything is from heaven, chutz me'yira Shamayim, except for the fear of heaven. The fear of heaven has to come from us upwards. Because when you think about it, what goes in goes out. Or in other words, you are where your mind is. So make sure your mind is where you want it to be. What goes in, what it called, it will define what goes out. So if you think about it, Shmuel in many ways in this case is the more lie. He's taking the logic of the world and applying it to Issa V'Heta, and that's the way we hold it. Thank you, Daddy. Very good. So now the second case. So Charlie jumped the shark, but it's okay. Because I wanted to have, so we're still in the middle of this. Let's keep going. Tanan, but listen, Charlie is now like a, high Gabra, right? You guys don't know it, but Charlie is essentially sitting and learning from like 6 a.m, almost like he's trying to chase my father over here. We have 2 people learning all day now. Unbelievable. Tanan on the land, net at right fight. If gravy dripped onto the flour, you need to remove a handful of the flour from its place, because we said the flour gets fried, and now it's fried from Pesach Tika, gravy. So says the Gemara, Kasal Kedat, I could make the presumption the silas soinenes, it's cold flour. That the upper dominates. So the hot gravy falls onto the cold flour. So then I can understand why you have to remove a handful of the flour. Because the hot gravy drips onto the flour, it heats up the flour. The flour in turn therefore heats up the gravy. and therefore the gravy itself is roasted by the heat of the flour. And the Ramana says regarding a Pesach and everything that has to do with the Pesach, including its gravy, it has to be fire roasted, and not something that's roasted from a fire derivative, from something that was heated up from a fire. The lower one dominates. Now we got a problem. Since the flour is cold, it cools off the gravy, so the gravy is now cool. If that's the case, why do I got to remove a handful of its place? It should be enough to simply remove it. I'll grant you got to remove it, but to go ahead and take away a whole portion of the thing, right? That's a little nuts. You don't have to. The cold is the one that dominates. Says the Gemara 76:8.
Rashi says you could eat the whole thing. You don't have to remove anything.
Right. Repeat that, Daddy, because that's very important. Rashi says forget about remove it from its place. Rashi says completely up. It says no. You can. What do you call it? You can absolutely go ahead and eat it straight out because tator gova.
That's why
this argues a little bit on that.
That's why it's in parentheses. That's why.
Right, that's right. The reason why I brought it is because that's only Rashi's cheshbon. Tosfos and the others argue and say since you're dealing with a liquid and a liquid gets belay into the thing, it's not so simple. So it's a machlekes rishonim. So you can leave the lashon, but Rashi clearly says tator gobar is an absolute. The underneath one, the bottom one is the most powerful. It's absolute. Boom, that's it. You can absolutely eat it. Okay. So now we're on 76:8-2. We're dealing with hot flour. You're right. If it was
why are they assuming that? Yitzhak?
It's cold.
Why are they assuming that it's hot flour?
It's not assuming. The only way they can get out of the box, the only way they can get out of the corner and not be a question on Shmuel is only to say that it's hot. Simple. In other words, I want to know, but Jeff is making the point again. It seems like silly arguments here. Hot, cold, hot, cold.
No, because
if something is true, if something is true in halacha, it's got to be true. In other words, you made an assumption. Look how it starts off. I'm assuming the silas sinenes, that's cold flour. Gemara says, why are you making such an assumption? It's hot flour.
But that's simple. What I'm saying. Why make that assumption? Why make the assumption that it's hot flour?
Okay.
No, because it says.
In other words,
because it says that yitel is mekoymai. You have to remove. It says in the Mishnah you have to remove it. So according to Shmuel, if you're going to remove it, it has to be hot.
Okay, I see. Okay.
Right, no. But you're right. You're saying, why isn't it a good question on Shmuel? The answer is, it is a good question on Shmuel. But Shmuel says, you can't prove that I'm wrong. Because you made an assumption. Once you made an assumption, I'm allowed to make an assumption the other way.
Right.
You see, the whole proof against Shmuel is based on an assumption. It's a logical assumption.
Yeah, I see now going back to 75b2 in the Mishnah where it says one should remove a handful of flour. They're not going to remove it unless it was hot. So I see that point. Well, yes, I see.
But the question, but the question, and Jeff, you're right, because we're trying to say Shmuel is wrong. We're trying to say Shmuel is wrong. That the bottom is not the all-powerful one. It's the thing that's falling onto it is all-powerful. But the answer is, we're making this question on Shmuel based on a presumption that the flour is cold, a presumption that the floor of the oven, earthenware oven was cold. Once you make a presumption, the other side, the other side of the argument can say, I don't accept your presumption. It's not a good proof to say I'm wrong. And again, to prove somebody wrong on hearsay doesn't work. The argument by definition is a weak argument. It's a good argument, but it's based on a presumption. Based on a presumption, I don't have to accept your presumption. So that's what he's saying. B'soiles rusachas, it's hot flour. Now, no problem. It's a hot flour. I have to remove because the bottom one is all powerful, and this thing fell onto the hot. It got reheated from the hot, and it bounced back, or whatever it is. It's got to be removed, right? You understand? Your points, everyone's making the right points. Yes, you have to remove it. But remember what we're trying to do here. Is Rav right, and the upper one is powerful, or is Shmuel right? Bottom one is powerful. Right now, we're trying to bring proof to Rav that the upper one is powerful, but we're only making proofs from assumptions, not from facts. If it's an assumption, in other words, it's not fake news. It has to be based on facts, no assumptions. The moment you work with assumptions, we're living through a world right now where assumptions are taken as facts. Nobody thinks, nobody questions, is that real? And that's the truth. The Gemara never does that. The Gemara will drive and drive and drive, ask the most silliest questions, but they're not silly. They're questioning the assumption, the underlying assumption that's going on in the first place. Is it true? Over here, I have no proof whether it's cold or hot. So if I have no proof, I got no proof. Let's go further. Tanan, we learned, if somebody basted the carcass of the carbon pesach with truma, oil of truma, if everybody registered in a kahanim, then you could eat it. Im shel Yisrael. But if it was Jews that are registered on it, now we got a problem that it's basted with truma, which only a kohen is allowed to eat. Im chayhu, if it's raw, yidichenu imtzali, hu yaklem. If the carcass is raw, you rinse it off, and if it's roasted, you should peel it off from the outside, because raw is easy to wash off. Something that's already roasted has crevices, and the oil went in. Rab, all good according to Rab. Now, Jeff, pay attention, because this is what it is. Rab, that the upper one dominates, the top dominates. This is good, very good. That's the reason that Mishum Diloit's 9-year-old, because the upper, the oil which was smeared on, the truma oil that was smeared on was cold. And since it was cold, and it's the dominant one, cold does not penetrate. Cold is not boileya, does not penetrate into the meat beyond the thin layer on top. So all you have to do is peel off the thin layer of the carcass of the carbon pesach. But according to Shmuel, says the lower one, in this case the whole carbon pesach, dominates. The Mishnah is hard to understand. Since the lower one, the meat of the carbon pesach, is hot, it absorbs the oil. The cold oil falls onto the hot meat. According to Shmuel, the hot meat is the dominant one, and it accepts into it all the oil. In that case, why do you say it's only need to remove the peel, the upper level of the meat? You should have to cut away a good inch or two of the meat where it. So now, once again, yes, you have to. The Mishnah says I only have to do the top level. So now, according to Rav, it works out because the cold teruma is going on the hot meat. The cold is the dominant one. It only goes in a drop. But according to Shmuel, that the bottom counts. The bottom is the hot meat. It draws in. According to him, it should draw into more oil and you should have to cut away. So from our Mishnah, it looks like Shmuel. The Mishnah does not hold like Shmuel. Shani Sicha, says the Gemara. Smearing is different. Because in basting, you don't use a lot. You use only a very small amount to baste. Right. So the amount of oil that you use was really minuscule. So therefore, even if it all got, even according to Shmuel,
doesn't go in.
Hot. It was so little that the amount that it would soak in would stop at the upper level and you could peel off. So Jeff, in other words, here again, an assumption was made, and it says you can't bring proof against me with an assumption because I can make another assumption that there wasn't a lot of oil. So even where the bottom one draws it in, it didn't have enough to draw in except into the upper level. Again, you have no definitive proof against me. That's really what's playing out over here, back and forth. And knowing the background, like Charlie brought up before, about Rav and Shmuel, about Isurim, where we go like Rav by Isser Veheta, by permitted and not permitted, and Shmuel only by money, it explains, by the way, why the Gemara keeps trying to bring proof to Rav, because it's trying to get it to go like Rav. Because normally we would paskin like Rav in this situation. Okay? Says the Gemara, now the Gemara says just the opposite. I'm going to bring you proof to Shmuel. Because cham l'soy cham aser, if something hot falls into something hot, it becomes aser. Hot milk into hot meat, it becomes aser. V'chein soinen shenosan l'toy cham aser. So too, cold that was put into something hot, cold milk that was put into hot meat, right? The milk becomes aser. Cham l'soich tzoynein, but if it was hot milk, it was hot milk that was put into cold meat, v'tzoynein l'soich tzoynein, or cold into cold milk into cold meat, matia. All you have to do is rinse it off. Here you see it says very clearly, the bottom one dominates. Because if you put cold into hot, the bottom is hot, it becomes aser. There you go, exactly like Shmuel. So it says the Gemara, hot into cold, right? Hot into cold, all you have to do is rinse it. Says the Gemara, since the upper one is hot, when the lower one cools it off, it's impossible as it's cooling it off that it didn't absorb a little bit. Obviously, the hot had to have absorbed a little bit, right? The cold underneath had to have absorbed somewhat, something of the hot thing that fell on it. I'll grant you this. It can't be much if I hold that the bottom one is the dominant. But you still have to take it into account that the hot thing fell on it, right? It should require at least peeling off of the upper level. Simple rinsing shouldn't work. It says you're right. Let's learn the Bryce a little different. Hot that fell into cold, you should peel. Cold into cold, all you have to do is rinse off. Another brisa that proves that Shmuel is correct, that the bottom one is the most powerful. Tani idach, we learned, if hot meat fell into hot milk, if cold meat fell into hot milk, aser, they both become aser. But if hot milk, if hot meat fell into cold milk, or cold meat into cold milk, mediach, simply rinse off the milk and you're good to go. So what do you see from over here? That the bottom is the dominant one. So says the same kind of guy's question like before. Wait a minute. If hot meat falls into cold milk, one should only rinse it off. Since the meat is hot, I grant you, the bottom one is more powerful, but the upper one, the hot meat, must have taken in something from the milk, something, even a minute amount, at the very least. Khalifa Mia and the Bayi should require peeling, not just rinsing. And they said, you're right, we're missing some words in the Brisa. If hot falls into cold, if hot meat falls into cold milk, you have to peel off the thin upper level of the meat. But if it was cold meat that fell into cold milk, mediach, simply rinse it off, and you're good to go. All right, and this is where we would come and say, the bottom line here is we pass it like Shmuel, and because if you think into it, Shmuel is the more logical in physical reality. Amamar, tzoyne, the tzoyne mediach, cold into cold, you rinse. Amar Rav Huna, lo yishana, we don't say this, elish shaloi malachai. Only where one of them was not salted. Because as we know, everybody, salt is the way we remove the blood from the meat. It's the reason why kosher meat is so salty. So that means that salt penetrates. Salt is a penetrating agent. So Rav Huna says, cold into cold, you only have to rinse. That only works. That's only if you had not salted the forbidden item. Avo, malacha, if you did salt it, aser, it becomes aser. The Amar Shmuel, because Shmuel says, Meliach harehu kiroseach. Salting is like something which is hot. Why? Because what does salt do? Salt is the agent. It's the thing that penetrates, it pulls out the blood. It's in fact the most powerful thing. We need to remember here, just as a matter as an aside. Once upon a time, not that long ago, just think about Mahatma Gandhi and the Salt March. Salt was more precious than gold. It was the preserver. It was the refrigerator. It was the thing that you preserved your food in. Salt has unbelievable properties. Today we don't appreciate it. We don't appreciate it because we got refrigerators. But in a world before refrigerators, salt was a key to life, almost akin to water. So, the other small, salt is like something which is hot. Which means that if something is marinated, is like something which is cooked. Okay, that means if you marinated permitted food in vinegar together with acidic food, it's as if they were cooked together, and it becomes no good. It's exactly what it means. Amar Rava, Tzad Yom Shmuel. This that Shmuel said. We're on 76a3, the bottom. That salt is like being hot. We don't say this. Only where the salted food is so salty that it's unedible. It has so much salt on it that if it falls into something else, it's going to have an effect on that something else. But if it's to be eaten, even though it's insalted, then the rule does not apply. Okay, which the rule is not apply. It then means it could be it could be rinsed off. Okay, and therefore it could be rinsed off. So now the Gemara says, I'll give you the example. Ahu bar goizlo denoko lechado de chamcha. A certain young pigeon fell into a cast of kamcha. Kamcha is like kutach. It was a milchiga, a milk-based dish. Okay, a milk-based dip. Shorole Rabbi Chanina b'rei Rabba me'pashroina.
And it was so salty.
Allowed it to be eaten. Amar Rabba. He allowed you to eat the pigeon. He allowed you to eat the pigeon, even though the pigeon is meat. And this kamcha is milk, right? And this kamcha is milk. And this kamcha is a milk product that is very, very salty. A lot of salt was put into it. He said it's okay to eat the pigeon. You're allowed to eat the pigeon. What?
It's likely salted.
No, the case is a pigeon falls into.
No, the dip is likely
we don't know
salted.
Yet.
Yeah.
You know, we're going to see what it is. No, it's a dip that's edible. Even though it has quite a bit of salt in it, it's an edible dip. Obviously, it's an edible dip. It's not salted to the point that it's unedible. No, it's edible, but it's a very salty. It's a spicy, salty dish. Okay? He says, well, no, it's a loud. It's not salted to the point that it's unsalty. It's a spicy, salty dish. Okay? Who's wise enough to eat it in such a case? The son of Rabbi the Gavra, because he would tell you the reason why he's so lenient. He's Makel. Ki Omar Shmuel Malicha Hareya Kiriseach. Where does Shmuel say that salt is like being hot? And therefore, theoretically, the milk product, the salty milk product, should have answered the pigeon, should have said no to the pigeon. Only something that's unfit to eat because of its salty. It's so salty, you can't even eat it, and so much salt will go into the other thing. Hi, nekel machmas molcha. Here, the kamcha is fit to be eaten, even though it's quite salty. But that's its thing. It could be quite salty. So therefore, if the pigeon falls into this kamcha, even though it's salty, right, you're allowed to eat it. You know what the problem with all of this is? There's a major problem. It occurred to me yesterday, the question. This is a problem of basa v'cholav, right? Meat and milk, right? And the Gemara is saying that if it's salt, don't worry about it. The meat, the milk did not, the milk product didn't go into the meat. Here's the thing. What are we talking about here? A pigeon. A pigeon is fowl, is a bird. Minat Torah, basa v'cholav is only with a behema. You shall not cook a young goat in the milk of its mother. Minat Torah, chicken is not fleshix. Minat Torah, a bird is not fleshix. Where does it talk about fleshix? Only on a gidi. In that case, we're only dealing with the Rabbanon. We're only dealing with the rabbinical isser of not eating birds because they look like meat with the salt thing. So over there, it's a Rabbanon. It's only rabbinical. Will be lenient. Even where it's salty, but I can still eat it. Okay, you're off the hook. It's not a problem. But maybe on regular meat, which is would be a diaraisa, a biblical isser. Maybe I would say even if it's something that's edible because it's salty, I'm not allowed to. So I actually asked my friend Shlomo Perlstein, who gives the shiur here in where we're in Brooklyn. And he said he thought of the question too. He says, you're right. So the only answer he has, we'll have to say, it's obviously going according to a man Diyama, who says even Minat Torah, birds are also to eat Minat Torah. Even though logically that's not the case. He says you can only understand this Gemara according to the Rabbanon. My father's about to give another answer.
No, it's only the Rabbanon. It's only the Rabbanon, the birds. That birds you cannot eat with milk.
So
it's only the Rabbanon.
So Daddy,
what?
So then we have a problem. So now we have a problem. How do you bring proof from this Gemara? How do you bring proof? Because this Gemara is saying, well, I'm going to let you be lenient. I'm going to let you be lenient that food that has a lot of salt but is edible, you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to throw the stuff away. Maybe that's only on a dirabanan, on a rabbinical problem. But if it's biblical, if it was a piece of goat meat, maybe it would be usher. That's my question. So you have to, you're forced to say, Jeff, this is a case where you're forced to say, how do you explain this Gemara then? So you're forced to say that there must be somebody, there must be a man de'ama that's saying that bird meat is also a diraisa. You have no choice. Otherwise, this Gemara really is very schwer. I wrote the question on the side, and I wrote to myself, it needs a lot of work. I don't really have a good answer. I thought of the question yesterday as I was preparing the Gadaf. I said, this only proves that you have a leniency on a rabbinical thing. On a biblical thing, who said I have a leniency? Maybe even if I can eat it because it's salty. But biblically, if it's goat meat or cow meat, right? I wouldn't be allowed to eat it. I don't know the answer. So the answer, I'm reaching for an answer here. My friend reached for an answer. Listen, you have no choices. You're gonna have to say there's a mandiyama that says that bird meat is also biblical. Yeah, Daddy.
No, I mean,
oh, you got frozen. Okay. So, there you go. So says the Gemara Baito, Bahani. Yeah. I'm losing you. We'll talk afterwards. Hold on. Bahani milichai. This is only by a raw pigeon. Avot tzali by a khalifa. But a roasted pigeon requires peeling of its upper skin. Even though the kimcha could be eaten, it's still below, because it does go in a little. Below amrin eladelesple pile. This is only good where there are no cracks in the meat. Avo ispe pile. If there are cracks in the meat, aser, it becomes aser. V'chim misubal misable aser. And if you put in seasoning spices, you put in sharp spices, now you screwed it up completely. You got to get rid of the meat, because you salt with spices, now everything's going to go in. Amarab says, we're on Amid Base 76b1, and let's see in the next 10 minutes if we can get to the Mishnah. Says like this: shumen, fatty meat that was of a slaughtered animal, shetziloid that was roasted, in basa nevela, together with meat of a nevela, kochush also. In other words, you had a fatty piece of good meat that was slaughtered correctly, fatty, juicy, fatty meat, and it was roasted together with nevela, an animal that simply died, and it was roasted together with nevela meat, which was very thin. It was a very thin, not fatty at all. What's the halacha? The answer is it's awesome. It's no good. Right, the Gemara, my time, or why? Because they fatten each other. In other words, they're in the same pot. They're being roasted together. Their juices flow together. The fact that the majority, the fatty one, is from a good piece of meat doesn't take away from the fact that you're putting it together with an available piece of meat, and it's going to have an effect one to the other. The Levi Omar, that's what Rab says. The Levi Omar, no. Just the opposite, even if the good piece of meat, which was slaughtered correctly, is the thin piece of meat, and the meat from the baby that just simply died is the fat piece of meat, he says it's still mutter, it's still allowed. The good piece of meat is allowed. You roasted them together. My tama, reicha b'yalmahu. It's only aroma. What connected the two of them? Aroma. The smells that came out of one went into the other. It's only aroma. V'reicha lav milsehi. And aroma is nothing. It doesn't have mamoshes. This should be, by the way, the Grove should use this as an advertisement. Aroma has no factor against this competition. Anyways, go. Yeah.
Yitzchak, it must be that the kosher meat and the nevela meat were in the oven, but they were not touching each other.
Correct. They're not touching each other.
Then it's only the aroma that went through. But if they were touching each other, it would be also.
Correct. And I believe we're going to get to that. I believe the Gemara is about to talk about that. That obviously they cannot be touching each other because it's only aroma. If it was touching already, then of course they become like one. They become like one. They become one, essentially one thing, and that's no good. But I think the Gemara is going to talk about it. So let's see. Of the Levi, of the Reish Galusa. Levi ruled in an actual case in the house of the Reish Galusa, B'gadi v'dovaracha, by a goat and a pig that were roasted together. They were roasted together. They were not touching each other. And he said, the goat is good. And by the way, everybody, we hold like Levi, by the way. So if you want to know what bacon tastes like, you can take a big enough pot, put pig on one side, put a kosher piece of meat on the other, make sure they don't touch each other, just the aroma goes back and forth, and bada bing, bada boom, and you're good to go.
My question is, what does what does a pig doing in the Reish Galus's house?
Very good question, Danny. And the answer is
he was the head of
the answer is Zui Torah V'Tzara Lamadata. Levi probably brought the pig and said, I'm going to do this in the house of the Reish Galusa. You can imagine what was going on in the papers the next day. A pig in the Reish Galusa's house, right? And Levi cooked it together, and then they had a feast with the meat. And that way he was Megala. It was a major YouTube. It was a major YouTube. So I'm telling you, it was a YouTube clip. Yeah, he wouldn't get away with it today.
He wouldn't get away in Borough Park.
He wouldn't get away with it anyway. That is 100% correct. We got 5 more minutes, so let's get moving here. Yeah, let's see if we can get to the Mishnah. Meisvei, they challenged Levi from this brisa. Ain't soidin shnei pesachim ke'echad. You're not allowed to roast 2 Pesachs together. Mipnei taruva is because of intermingling. Since each Pesach has its own registered, right? Each Pesach is unique, is mutually exclusive with its own people that are registered on it. If you put the 2 Pesachs together, you can get mixed up and they get commingled and you'll have a problem. My love, says the Gemara, Tarus Tamein, Ta'amin. What are we talking about? What's getting commingled? The taste, the aroma, the flavors are transferring one to the other through the aroma. The Koshel Levi, then it's a question to Levi because you see that taste is ma'akiv, taste counts, aroma does count. Says the Gemara, like, no, the Bnei Taruv is kufin because of the possible commingling of the carcasses. Or as my father said before, where the 2 carcasses might come to touch each other. They come to touch each other. Now you have a problem. They're being roasted together and you get a problem with the people who are registered on it. Hachanami mistaber. This is mistaber. This is what I was telling you there. That's why it was coming up. Migdatani seifa, because the seifa of the Brisa teach us that the restriction against roasting together goes like this: Afilo, even a gedi v'teleh, even a goat and a lamb. So it's clear that we're dealing with 2 different kinds of Pesachs. One is a goat, one is a lamb. We're not going to get mixed up. The if you say the problem is the mingling of the carcasses, that's why it gives me the case of a goat and a lamb, because even though they're clearly 2 different things, they still might be commingled, they might end up touching each other. If you say the reason is because of the flavors intermingling one with each other. Mali gadila v'tileh, mali gadivu gadi. What's the difference if it's a goat and a lamb or a goat and a goat? If that was going to be a problem of flavors intermingling, then it could be the same classification. Elamai, okay? So Elamai, the answer is we're dealing with the same thing. So now, Elamai, what are we going to say? The only reason this price is said is because of the 2 carcasses might touch each other. But the mingling of the flavors and the transfer of aroma is permitted. Okay? Let me say this is therefore a refutation of Rav, that Rav, in fact, where Rav says flavors count, and here you clearly see that flavors do not count. We're on 76b2, almost to the Mishnah. What are we dealing with over here? Where you sought to roast the 2 Pesachs in 2 separate pots. In that case, there's no intermingling of the aromas. And the only thing we're worried about is the interminglings of the carcasses, that the 2 hot carcasses might come to touch each other. Say the Gemara, the Shnei Kedei Sal Kedatach? What are you talking about? We know that a Pesach is only allowed to be roasted on a spit, right? Remember, rotisserie style. Where the pots come in here. And for the Gemara, Ela Ke'ein Shnei Kedei, like 2 pots. V'hochi kama. Ain't soilin, you're not to roast Shnei Pesachim Ke'echad, 2 Pesach offerings together, V'pnei Taruvos, because of the intermingling. My Taruvos, what's the Taruvos? Taruvos Tamim, the intermingling of flavors. V'afilu Ke'ein Shnei Kedei, and even if you roast them similar to two pots, meaning they're completely separated from each other. The leket taruvas ta'amim, so therefore the flavors won't intermingle. Also, mishum taruvas gufin. It's also because of the intermingling, the possible intermingling of the carcasses, va'afilu gedi b'teleh, and even the goat and the lamb. So in other words, we're worried here about both things. We're worried about, if we could say that we're worried about, first of all, the intermingling of flavors, and even if you do it in such a way like it's like two pots, you put the two spits far enough apart, we're still afraid that when you take them off while they're hot, they're going to touch each other and they're going to commingle. Omer Rav Mori Kitanoi. The truth of the matter, this argument of Levi and Rav is a machlokes Tanoim. Now here, this is very fascinating. Rav, Shmuel, Levi were all the last Talmidim of Rebbe HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, Rebbe the Prince. Rebbe was the last of the Tanoim. Rav and Rav alone is considered the bridge between the end of the Tanoim and the beginning of the Amoraim. Okay, the difference between the Tanoim and the Amoraim. Shmuel and Levi are already considered Amoraim. So he's saying over here that Shalchak is between Amoraim. I can show you that in fact this argument went on before in the days of the Tanoim. Kedetanya. If somebody removes hot bread from an oven, and then places the hot bread on the mouth of a cask of truma wine, so now the question becomes, what happens to this bread? Do the fumes from the wine permeate?
Gets absorbed. Yeah.
The bread can only be eaten by a kohen or not. Rameir to non-kahanim, only a kohen can eat it. Rabbi Yehuda says it's allowed. But Rabbi Yosi says when the bread was made out of wheat, it's okay because wheat doesn't absorb so much. But it's also if it's made out of barley because barley is absorbable. Because barley bread absorbs the aroma of the wine. Tanoi. It's about like it's Tanoim. The Marsova. Rabbi Yehuda holds Reichel Milsihi. Aroma is not a factor, and therefore the bread is allowed to be eaten by everybody. Umarsova Rabbi holds Reichel Milsihi. Aroma is a factor, and the fumes of the wine go into the bread, and therefore only a kohen is allowed to eat it. Levi. Now, according to Levi, Vadai Tanoi, it's certainly a Tanoi argument. L'Rav, name it Tanoi. Do we say according to Rav also? Because Rav, at the end of the day, Rav, what do you call it? The Rav can see that Tanoi mentioned the Mishnah. Only Rameh and Rav Yosi hold his opinion. Rabbi Yehuda might hold like Levi. Well, Rav could possibly say that even Rabbi Yehuda really holds that aroma is a factor. But in this case, he says the wine is not strong enough, the fumes of the wine are not strong enough to go into the bread. So what is Rav hold? Amalach Rav, the Kula Amarecha Milsi. Everybody would agree, all time would agree that aroma is a milsa, is a factor. Lav Itmaralov was it not said so that he, Omer Rabba Barachana Omer Reish Lakish, Rabba Barachana said the name of Reish Lakish, regarding a hot bread and an open cask of wine. Everybody says the bread is also because certainly the fumes go into the bread, and fumes count if we can guarantee that it went into the bread. But cold bread and a closed cask of wine, of course it's allowed to everybody. Hot bread, hot bread in a sealed cask of wine. Do we say that the fumes escape the wine cask? Or cold bread and an open cask wine. Do we say that cold absorbs the fumes or not? In this case of Rav, in the case of roasting two types of meat together, which remember we said the kosher meat and the non-kosher meat, Kipas chama b'chavos pesucha damya. It's a case of hot bread in an open cask, which everybody agrees is also. So too would be in that case. Tanya Rav Kahana Bereda Rechinin Saber. Rav Kahana says the name of Rechinin Saber in a brayso, pas sha'ofa, bread that was baked in an oven, together in tzili betano, with betano. If bread was baked in an oven together with roasting meat, also le'echa b'chutacha. You're not allowed to eat the bread with chutach, which is a milchig, a dairy dip, because we're saying the bread that was baked together with the meat inside this oven took in the flavors from the bread, from the meat. So the bread is now a fleshigim bread. Says the Gemara, Hu beniso, the itva bahadi bishra. There was a fish that was once roasted together with meat. 76b3. 76b3. Also, asked to eat the fish with chutach because the fish was related with the stuff of the meat. And now we finish up. Even the fish alone that was switzer because of different reason entirely. Salted fish is also mishum the kashilarecha. It's terrible for bad breath. Uledover for something else, and Rashi explains saras. It somehow creates biblical leprosy. That biblical leprosy said this is a dangerous food to eat, very salty fish. So that means the herring should not be too salted. Very good. We're up to the Mishnah on the bottom of 76b3.